Well, hello, this is Dr. Lemmon, and this is my January 2025 chat. It's actually doing it on Christmas Day, so I'm kind of dressed up for the holiday, um, so to speak. Um, so, in the year 2025, what I'm going to be talking about is some crazy concepts that I put together that are not necessarily integrated into normal concepts in life. Some of them over time have actually, research has actually found them to resonate or be more true. Um, and 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 the blogs will more or less follow to some degree. Not too sure how much, because I've already got 4 or 5 blogs written. I hope to do some traveling this year now that not only has the world uh, gotten less restricted, at least for a short period of time, hopefully, but as far as traveling goes, and I do think travel is important. We really we live in a neighborhood, we live in a family, we live in a real small environment, and we forget the world is very different. And so getting out and traveling gives you a chance. If you don't do like bad travelers and impose their culture on everyone else, if you go and experience what's going on, it's very, very rewarding. And it's part of what I was teaching. I did pilgrimage every year to somewhere and take 14, 20, 25 people, and we would go somewhere on a trip. It was kind of fun, and we got to interact and see the other cultures. So those are important elements. So I will be throwing out some of those ideas, and and maybe as a kind of a quick review, will touch on a few points. Number one, I think I mentioned in my blogs about the fact that we actually blink. There's a blink rate with everything. Literally, you can tell when you get angry or get upset or get passionate or whatever happens in your world where all of a sudden energy is flowing or you're intensely working or you're just digging a hole, whatever that is, your body starts to warm up because of the fact that you're totally focused and totally into it. Um, we basically we would overheat, and so the reason that we only have such a small percentage of consciousness and so much investment, and literally we have to think about something, put something together, and then sit and feel the energy starting to flow before we jump into it. We literally have to kind of build a story for us to participate in the experience called life, um, which we all do. Ask anybody, and they got a story right there. So those are indexing. That's really very important for us to engage, and engagement is really very important. Um, Back when we first walked out of the Africa and started kind of wandering around on our feet, why pretty much we were confrontational and defensive. Everything was a threat. And so over time, we have learned to interact. Um, and the wholeness of the planet, or to arrive at a place where everybody living on the planet could get on the same page at the same time and be able to have a focus as planetary people, why then to be able to do that, to come together, we have to start to notice the differences, not to make them wrong or not to make everybody the same. We tried that, it didn't work. We tried imposing our ideas on others, it never has worked very well. We really have to be able to expand it out a little bit and start to understand that they should operate a little differently. And we just got to start to notice that we to some degree notice that now. Talk to anybody about their family, and it's like there's more conversation about that than there was back a few years ago. But when I was a kid, you were part of the family culture package, or you were ostracized and nobody even knew your name or who you were or had pictures of you. Uh, and that was the way it was then. And now today, there's a little bit more intermingling going on, and we're all a lot more distant. We all grow up and move on. We don't, you know, not all, but a bunch. So there's some variations that we start to see coming down. So basically, we have a blink rate. We just don't are not all buzzed and turned on all the time, and because that wears the whole system down. So we need to conserve. So that's called the law of conservation. It really was original written uh, about diesel engines, but it just found out it was very applicable Entropy is another whole story that's still kind of in question with humans, whether we zero out or not. And we may very well do that energetically. We will certainly need to rest. Sleep is also important, but it's not important just because of getting rest, but it's during the time when we actually update our files. So, so I mentioned blink rate, and let me talk a little bit about the way the operation system works today. So this is probably um, all based on science. There might be a little bit of poetic licensing coming in the way I interpret things, but for the dynamic of what goes on in there, which I've been talking about, really is just stored into patterns. What it really says is like it's like going to a foreign country. We speak a different language, but we do that internally. And so when we're born into this world, we start to, well, it takes us a little while to be able to, we start to build a base. And the information that we store somewhere in the neocortex, that information that we store in there is pretty much codified. It's put into some type of a symbol, I call it, or a pattern. Um, there are a lot of spoken languages, but very few written languages. Writing things and recording things down are very complicated, and get a whole group of people to think the same way it is not that easy. We find some common symbols from way back in BC, 1,000 years BC, 2,000 years BC, that have things that we can look at as like waves might be water, might be wind, might be. I mean, it's hard to interpret symbols. It's very, very difficult. Um, Let me give you an example. Uh, French make cars, Fiat, they make cars, right? So if you go to France and you look at a car and you say, I got a broken windshield. So then you have to find out what word you would use for windshield on a car, right? Um, Assuming you're American and you're trying to translate that into something, they have a word, of course, for windshield on a car. But if you look that word up in a French dictionary, what you're going to find, French English dictionary, you're going to find that that means the first translation is it means a little window. Um, Way, way back in the day, French had buildings that were stacked up, multi-story, um, and they had shutters on the outside because it gets a lot of rain, a lot of storms. So, so they had shutters. Well, it gets dark when you close the shutters in the daytime. So they had these little windows. They were just a little glass window towards the top of that particular room or towards the ceiling to an outside to let light in. So there'd be light in the room. And it didn't have any shielding or any guard on the outside or any covering on it because it was way up. Nobody's going to see in that window. So it didn't matter. Um, so that's the word that they assigned to being a windshield on a car. You start to see that we take some concept or idea and we start to look at our dictionary, look how many meanings we have for words. It didn't always be that way. We have thousands and thousands. So you look at a word and have five or six or seven meanings, and sometimes you can follow the logic of how it arrived there, and sometimes you go like, "What just happened there? What was that?" Right? It's like it's kind of scary. So being able to share ideas and being able to interact ideas just within the states in the United States is a challenge. In the world, it's really even a bigger challenge. Uh, we can write it off and say, I don't speak your language, but I'm just saying the concepts you have don't always translate into their language, at least not in the first or second or third tier. It might be way down on that dictionary list somewhere to find windshields. Um, so we exchange ideas and things, and we make an awful lot of assumptions. So for us to be able to exchange ideas and to make those assumptions means that we then index it with a story. In other words, we cannot talk about those patterns. So when we start to put into a written language where we can then generate some type of a symbol that means that, or a group of symbols to be able to enunciate that, because of a lot of language is put together with letters that would have sounds assigned to them, so that if you said the word mouse, then those letters would indicate that sounding, and then a mouse was a way to interpret that symbol or that item, which would be a mouse. but it could be a toy mouse. It could be a real mouse. It could be, do you see how it's not very concrete? We like to think that we're understood, but we're not often understood. And if you think about a day's conversation or at a Christmas party or somewhere and you had a couple of drinks and you're talking to people, they don't always understand. And we've found that lots of times we say things to people and we offend them, and we find out later that, oh, like, wow, um, I didn't know. I'm sorry. It's like we can get misinterpreted. Doesn't communicate very well. Yep, we run around in this brain assuming that everybody's on the same page and we're all thinking the same way. And that's a challenging piece because then we don't have a relationship with what's going on in the other person. We miss that. Um, so if we're going to reunite ever onto a global people, yes, it's not going to happen in my lifetime. But if we're already good, but we're doing the groundwork for it right now. We're starting to package that together. We're starting to ask the questions. It's like we're starting to realize that being totalitarians and taking over the world is that's not going to work. So now we have to start and we have to say, oh, now we have to find a way to relate to all these people and all their crazy ideas and the way they cook and what they do and the way they interchange and the relationships they have um and it's enriching. It is enriching if we have an open mind about it and we start to correlate that and start to see that maybe we don't have a word that quite translates empathy, for example. In English, we have a word for empathy, which really is kind of a form of of just sympathy. But in other countries, France, Germany, they have a multitude of different words meaning empathy, but they're different gradients of being able to care for. Well, because we're over here on this across the ocean, and so we just we didn't do very much for getting along with the native people. We just kind of tore through it. But if you go back and read some of the books on the native people and the native cultures, well, you'll start to see that they really differentiated tremendously. Some of those tribal people got along because some of their ideas were very similar. So they could notice the difference and say, well, we do it this way and you do it that way. Oh, that was all fine. They got along. Some of them was totally, totally different. And at that point in time, then they were all warring with each other. So it wasn't, most certainly wasn't nice for us to come in and just take the country over and then take all the land and give it to someone when it wasn't theirs to give away. But that's most certainly what we did. We came in and we did all that. We discounted all that. Um, and you look at the famous Lewis and Clark, they went through and they actually would have the Indians actually most of the time save their lives as they were traveling. And here they would have a ceremony to thank the Indians for saving their lives. But what really did, they got dressed up in the military uniforms and they stood there with the American flag and they claimed the land for America. That's what they did, right? So it was like the territory doesn't mean it belongs to you. Now it belongs to us. We just claimed it. And the Indians thought, oh, it's a celebration. It's all cool. It's very, very sad. This is how we've functioned in our past. And, and now we're looking at how are we going to function. We're starting to try to imagine how we're going to function into our future, right? We can make up stories about what we're going to do. We can make plans. That's called a New Year's resolution. And and maybe some of you guys right now today, when you're hearing this, you've probably already made your New Year resolution, and for most of you, it's like already passe. Uh, and we don't do a very good job because we're mostly redundant. All of these dilemmas come because of the fact that the way that we store actual experiences in patterns doesn't translate to the way that we think in story indexing, or the way that we communicate, or the way that we enunciate or use language to communicate. So they're different. So all you have to do, I spent some time in law enforcement. I spent a lot of time counseling people. What they say, what's really going on is really not the same thing. It's just like really very different. Um, and you can kind of play with that a little bit. I taught a lot of intuition classes. I don't know what people would come in, they had some story about, that they, came from a different universe or that they had an aunt from a past life that talks to them or what, those, I'm not saying that isn't true, Yes, I'm discounting that to some degree because I'm saying that when you come that story, you then have a club membership. The people that agree with it, and everyone else disagrees with it. So you're packaging things up. You're not getting along. You're disassociating. Um, so it's not bad. The phenomena, don't give up the phenomena. Gosh, don't give up the phenomena, but don't try to sell it. So you've got to look at it. And this is why I say over and over again, you got to start asking questions. What's going on? Why? Lots and lots of questions. Don't look for an answer. Look for a bigger range because the reason why you can't see it is because the fact that we only have this small piece of consciousness, we're conserving energy. We don't want to invest too much energy because we can damage this device that we're running around in for 70, 80 years, whatever. And so we're trying to conserve all this. We're trying to package this. We're trying to create relationships on a story that we hopefully share. And all you have to do is get married for a few years, and you think that, wow, I had that all wrong. And then you get married again, or some of you guys get married and just say, well, I had it all wrong, but I'll just deal with it. Um, and and that doesn't work out real good either. So all of those workarounds that we have created uh, create their own angst and anxiety and create a lot of problems. And then you sit at some point in time thinking, well, this is the way it is. I just got to deal with it. Wow. Wow. So there goes creativity out the door. There goes your potential to be able to do something amazing with your life, to go out and do something and have some exciting things and go. It's just, you just narrow it all down to a routine. Redundancy, redundancy, redundancy. So the way that we convert energy into human life or into life on this planet or even this planet is to convert it all into redundancy, right? That's just what it is. Um, and it just becomes a pattern of repeating, repeating, and repeating. All those patterns that we have in our body that we had learned somewhere in the first part of life, the first 5, 6 years, is all movement orientated because that's pretty much what we did, at least first 3 years. And then after that, it's the beginning of putting together words that have some type of meaning, but we weren't too certain about it. So we just, sometimes it would work, sometimes it wouldn't. And so those elements then become more of a memory for a pattern or a situation, and those get stored. So that's one whole area. Then we go through and we get into the educational system, and they say A equals 2. 1 plus 1 is 2. 2 plus 2 is 4. We learn all this root. You see what we're doing? We're taking the ability to flow energy and create, and we're putting it into boxes and streams and labeling it and packaging it. So all we can do is work with that has, and then we can communicate and we can share that experience, but it's all within the context and limitation of that. Uh, we have several different ways of processing. You get 5 people sitting there bouncing an idea, getting them all to think on the same page is not easy, right? So let me go back to intuitive training. Intuitive training basically says when I'm sitting there looking at you, why I might see one of those patterns. We call them a picture, but picture means a sensory perception. So technically speaking, the theory is that an experience, a data, any event that occurs out there comes into you, your brain's in the dark. So it comes into you, and the data comes in through those 5 sensory perceptions. The same message, the same message that's going on comes in through those 5 sensory perceptions, but it gets translated in a little different way when it comes in, whether it's a smell or it's a taste or it's a feeling or it's a visual or it's a sound. It gets uh, it has the same message with that context. When you pull all those together, they have a little different time signature. They come in at a different rate. Literally, when you see something, it's a little like you got to kind of shake your head. What am I seeing here? You got to look at it again because it delays the visual message. It's faster. So it's waiting for the smell and the taste and all that other stuff and the feeling to catch up. And then it gives you the whole package as a response. And that's the way it works. So there's a little bit of time delay. It's like getting a focus on something. If it's very familiar to you, then you don't have a problem because you already know it. You have it indexed. So that means that we had to update the original files and make associations and index them, shortcuts. We're really good at that. We produce a lot of shortcuts, right? They last for a time, not forever, but for a time. So by the time you get to be my age, you don't always remember all the shortcuts that you put together when you were 12, 14, 20, 30, or whatever. And because we've navigated different ways. But Piaget with his work was a great demonstration when he worked with kids. He took a group of kids and did an experiment with them. And then their logic, they were young, they were preschoolers, and they didn't quite understand the example. If you have read any of Piaget's work, he basically took a glass full of water, and then he took a bigger glass, and he poured the glass in the smaller glass into the bigger glass. And then he said, which one has more water? Well, for the most part, the kids said the bigger glass. Now, yes, everybody knows it's the same amount of water, so it's not more water. They translated more water into bigger glass, bigger amount. What he was trying to example was that we don't make all those categories, even by the time we're just a preschooler, 6 years old, but we don't have all those categories made yet. It takes a long time for us to make it. A year later, he did the same experiment with the same group of kids a year later. And when he did it, he said, which one has more water? And all the kids now, the same kids a year later, said, that's a stupid question. It's got the same amount of water in both. What are you trying to do? Fool us, trick us? What is this, right? Already like, wow, you're deceiving us here. And then he showed them the probably Super 8 film back a long time ago, right? Of like the year before. And they said, no, that never happened. That never happened. You made that up. The film is a front. It's all false. Never occurred. They were defiant in that. So you start to see the memory changes, the parameters change. You don't remember the way it was. You remember the way it would be with your skill and ability today. Is it important to understand those operations? Well, that's why we taught intuitive training. It wasn't like to make neon sign psychics, although those are kind of fun. But it was that you look at someone and all of a sudden you can feel sensory perception that something is going on in them, your presence across from them. So we call that a matching picture. We call it a picture because it's a sensory perception. Picture doesn't mean picture. It's just that this is faster. The eyes are faster. So we label it picture, but it means sensory. It might be a smell, it might be a taste, it could be all the things, right? So you're sitting there and all of a sudden you have a sensory perception. Wow, that's very interesting. Uh, that means something in you. All of a sudden it goes in and it finds and it means something in you. Now, this is what's interesting. It doesn't mean the same thing in that person. That person's experience of learning about that symbol, learning about those patterns was different than yours. They have the same pattern. That's what's intriguing. We humans, more or less, kind of look like, generally speaking, we all fit into the car, we all fit through the doorways, you know. Somebody got to use a shoehorn, and some of them are skinny as a rail, but it's still within range, right? We don't have to build a special house. Well, maybe if you're really a giant, you'd have to have a special house. But I found that really tall people duck their head and move around amazingly well, and ever I've got it adapted to the fact that their head's going to touch the ceiling everywhere they go. So, so this is what's interesting is that when I look at that picture in that person, I could then talk about my story, but that doesn't do them any good. So what I do is I'm looking at their picture and they're sitting there and now their picture is energized because I got my attention on it. So their attention is going to go onto it. You know, we get along better than what we think. We really do. And so here I'm sitting and that lights up. And then I can see as that's lighting up in them, some alterations, some changes in their mood, in their feeling. Their face may come back, or they might ensue a certain smell in a room, or make noises. Or I had my my wife. was sitting side chair with me in a reading one time first when she first started taking classes from me, and I was reading this lady who came in because she had mercury poisoning, right? And so she wanted to find out why she had mercury poisoning. And nice young lady. And so I sat there in front. And of course, what turned up had nothing to do with mercury poisoning. She had just been an abused young lady at a very young age in a nursery school. Um, so I could see that I didn't know what that picture was. I was never abused at a very young age at a nursery school, so I didn't have a similar experience. But I most certainly, got a good beating every now and then when when I was disrespectful as a little tad, and so my grandmother would pull a whip off the branch off the willow. Right, and pound on me, and obviously it wasn't abusive in any way, shape, or form because it didn't leave any marks. But it just got some tears out of me. She was trying to pound in respect because that's what we did in the old days. Um, and uh, and so here she was having an experience. I, could have an offensive experience in a different sort of way than what she did. So what I had to do, I had to take that energy that she sits with, and I said, let's expand the range out a little bit. Let's get that because she has it trapped in. She literally has it contained so she doesn't think about it. She doesn't want to think about what happened to her as a kid. So she has it packaged up. As I get a little energy flowing into it, it starts to open up. Well, sometimes when it opens up, people will remember a story. Some of the fragments will come back if it's a subconscious picture. If not, sometimes there'll be some movement that occurs. In this particular lady, there was two things that occurred, both. Uh, she all of a sudden had some ideas that came to mind. I could see her eyes open up, and she already was seeing something. She was recalling something. And you could see her struggling with it, and she'd start to tremor. And then she flipped over on the floor, and she's flopping around the floor. So I told my wife, would you put your feet on her so she doesn't hurt herself? And then I just kept going with the intuitive piece. But that's all I was doing was just like, how do I make this? I can't necessarily make this a well because you could be catatonic or who knows what could happen, right? But can we open a pathway? Can we open a pathway, say, over the next year or 2 years, that you could start to be able to work with this and come to some terms with what happened to you, right? I don't know how many times I have scars. I don't remember where I got them from. So I have other people that, have scars and don't remember where they came from. And then now and then I'll run into a friend of mine and they'll say, you still got that scar on your ear, And I go, wow, yeah, I do. Where'd that come from? And we'd have a discussion. I go, wow, that's kind of interesting. I did something really stupid and hurt myself, and I, chose not to remember it. And then when I remember it, I feel kind of foolish. It's like, yeah, that was kind of a dumb thing for me to do. Well, okay, that's whatever. And so that's all part of life. We just narrowed down to meet the story that we use to interact with people. But I'm saying it goes much deeper. So this girl got back up again. The good news is maybe about 2 or 3 years later, she finally lost all that mercury poisoning. All those ideas were gone. All that trying to find a doctor that would treat her, all the tests that they did on it, like, nah, not a problem. She settled down. She got a relationship. She finally got out in the world and she just became a normal human being. In other words, she was able to write all that off, being able to make that okay, not necessarily forget that, but be able to flow out, be able to show up, be able to go out and find what she was no longer disabled. She'd go out and find a job. She did find a job. She did find a relationship and she moved on in life. Yes, it took a lot of time. This whole process takes a lot of time. I think that the hope and the prayer is that we live on this planet 70 or 80 years because we can work through some of the experiences we had in the first 4, 5, 6 years. Being able to adapt and be able to adjust into it. And I would say that's the same in all cultures, although the packages and experiences may be a little different. It may look very similar in the symbolic language because the symbolic language pretty much arrived from our experiences in the very beginning. She had an unconscious pattern in there because she was flopping around on the floor. So there was a movement piece. So it was not only just the abuse in the nursery school, there was something even deeper, right, that went back in. It doesn't mean it was abuse. Might have just been anything that was threatening that required that she move herself. She had to get out of the way. It could just been a puppy dog trying to lick her, and she was a little baby around 2 years old, and she was trying to move her body away from the dog that was licking her. Most certainly, the dog was just being friendly, and it was not going to hurt her, but she would have still been trying to flail her arms around and push the dog away, and that could be. There's no story in those patterns. So, we don't unearth a story. The ones that most the time we hit with intuitives are just simply stories that have been buried, right? So those are subconscious programmers. When we bring them up, then we can feel some relief. We feel energy removed, the person feels relaxed, and they start to have benefits a little bit faster than the unconscious ones. The unconscious ones take a lot longer to work their way through out of it because they don't have you can't get to it through exercise. You can't get to it by joining a sport. You can't go out and join a bowling league and all of a sudden make friends and think, oh, all that is gone. No, it doesn't quite work that way. So we're complex. The whole nature of this is very complex. And when we talk about things, we talk about them in the idea of here's the story. But you see four people telling the same story. I've been in law enforcement. I got witnesses. They got up there and they're all telling the same story, but they're telling it from their version of it. Like, wow, um, where do you get them on the same page? Well, that's pretty much what a district attorney does. He gets all the witnesses in and coaches them and gets them all to make their stories somewhat similar. And will actually coach them and say, don't put that part of it in. Stick with this part of it so that it's all a little bit set up to, which is maybe why we've got a lot of people in prison that probably didn't do anything. So when we got DNA, we were going back through and checking those cases and releasing a lot of people that didn't really do anything, right? We had witnesses and all kinds of things that were testifying, and now we go back and we find out, wow, they didn't do it. That's interesting. Are people lying? No, they're not lying. They make up a story, and the story is how they store it. They update the stories, they update that storage, and but those original patterns that come back in and help us put together the elements relating are still operating under there, are still operating in that base before we had language, before we learned the rules, before we had to go take an English class or grammar class. We had to learn 2 + 2 is 4. Before that, it's like you could have 2 apples and 2 bananas. That's 4, but really it's 2 apples and 2 bananas. So at what point in time do we separate the fruit out? So it could be 2 apples and 2 rocks. That's not 4 pieces of fruit. So now we got two and twos. At what point does an isolated two become different than a collective two? Those are elements that we have to start to learn. We apply that type of knowledge in our relationship to people. So, and we see that all of a sudden somebody looks different, acts different, reacts different, eats different, then all of a sudden it's not part of our group, it's part of their group. And that starts to make this segue. What what is nice to do is to be able to, and I've traveled in the world, and it's kind of like I'm a bit of an adventurer trying things. I don't have a problem eating a, barbecued tarantula or twice cooked rat or whatever, um, and and just to try it. And and so many times, even just 100-year-old eggs in China, I'm sitting with a group of huge group, and they're all sitting there, and there's these black eggs come out. And I go, oh, wow, 100-year-old eggs. Those are really cool. They're obviously not 100-year-old. They're just a cured egg. And I just, they're all on the table and nobody wanted to eat them. So I ate a couple of them. I go, wow, these are amazing. So I'm putting them all in my napkin and folding them up because now for the next week, I'm going to be eating these eggs, right? They're very good. I can remember in Morocco, they served out these little things that look like miniature, what we call, yeah, in the West Coast of the U.S. culture or in South America, tacos, which means snack, right? that like a little taco. But what they were lamb lungs, and they were just folded over little, yeah. So there was a plate of them for us in his group, and I tried one. A couple of people looked at them. I think one other person took a bite out of one and laid it down. I ate them all. They were great. They were amazing. They were delicious. It's like, wow. I don't know. Do you see the story of eating lamb lungs stops you from what that product is? It's a protein. Come on, give me a break. Protein's amazing, right? Protein just simply builds this massive chain of connective pieces, and then all of a sudden it becomes something. Yes. So whether that's DNA or whatever that is in there, it tells it to become something. But it all looks the same for a while, and then all of a sudden it starts to sort and become something. It's kind of amazing. Those are all run by some type of patterns, right? And and whether the DNA puts all those patterns forth, or there's another codex behind that, or another one behind that, I don't know yet. We don't know yet, right? Schrodinger wrote a book and it said, "What is life?" And basically, this was before we had DNA. And he said, looking at life, remember Stromberg's cat, Schrodinger's cat is like uh, talking to electrons, how they can identify and change and put a message through that's kind of confusing. We have a very, very unstable world when it gets down to the mathematics of it. Things change in form and everything else. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Um, they keep making better stories and better stories and better stories. And of course, now they've come up with the idea that there's no mass, which is what Albert said in the first place. Um, but but there's an expression for it. In other words, there's some type of an expression that comes into play. So we're energy that simply has to be translated to redundancy, and then redundancy then eventually burns up and runs out. So no longer maintains itself. So that's pretty much so it means, is this all an illusion? Well, it's if it's all an illusion, then it's kind of hard for us to make up a story. So all these things that we see in the world are indexes for stories. Uh, they may all have some symbology. They may all be some codex. They may be some formula. They may be all the above. That's what the scientific world is trying to figure out. So you can look at Brian Greene and string theory, and it's like I personally I like string theory, but it's very, very difficult to prove because you're really saying that we have a range, we have ranges, we have a range. And so anything smaller or bigger than that range, called Planck's, we can't process. We can't see it. We don't know anything about it. We know there's things out there because we feel the effect of it, like it's moving, it does something. We feel the force of it, but we can't see it. We can't test it. We can't do anything with it. So superstring theory says that out of somewhere, maybe out of the range of Planck's constant, something's producing energy. We get to see that energy in different types of sparkling little strings like that are kind of buzzing around. Cool idea. And then that starts to produce harmonics and sounds and brings all the elements together. That'd be an interesting codex, right? Probably a lot more complex than DNA. I'm not sure that they're going to figure that all out in a couple of years, but not sure they quick much and they're going to be around by the time they get to it. Um, but those are all ideas. But they're really good ideas. When we start to look at this, it's like, wow, what do we make important? What do we not make important? What can we discount? What can we hold sacred for ourselves? What there's you can get a whole group of people that can hold an idea as sacred and believe into it and cherish it, and then later on be very disappointed when it doesn't turn out to be true. We have all these end of the world people that have, down through the years, have picked a date for the end of the world, figured all the research out. Most of it came from biblical research, and they especially Old Testament, and they figure that all out, and then they've had deadlines. Come on, there's been time and time groups all over the place that have done that. Some of them afterwards commit suicide. Some of them before commit suicide, as they think it's the end of the world, right? It's kind of like, uh, and it's not that unusual. I took a group of people when Heaven's Gate house was torn down. There's a group of people who had a certain ideology, and space aliens were going to come, and they all committed suicide because they were going to go around the ship. Um, and once again, I'm not discounting phenomena. It's a great idea to think that something is going to help us. I'm not sure that it's going to come in as space aliens. It may come in just as information. It may be anything, but I don't know. If you're into space aliens and being saved by spaceships, then you should go to Danny Henderson's YouTube talks. She's a really sweet lady and a wonderful woman, and so she's done a lot of research on that, and I would most certainly respect all the research she's done. So those are people that have an expertise, and I'm just looking at how do we get along. That's what I've been trying to do all my life, right? Different piece doesn't mean that my ideas are going to be right. So normally I was very cautious putting ideas out, expressing something. I would then just simply do exercises and see what came out of the people in front of me. I never went into a workshop or a seminar thinking this is what I'm going to get. I always went in and said, here, give me 40 people and give me a place to put them all for a weekend, and I'm going to throw a bunch of exercises at them. We're going to see what's going to happen. And then when we see what's going to happen, all of a sudden we can start to notice, wow, there's a difference. I've done that with tons of different patterns and have people communicate and interact and find, wow, they value things different than someone else. Okay, right. We could we could then play with that a little bit. And if we play with it a little bit, we can become aware of that. And then we used to sit there and we would turn the television on and turn the sound off. And we would just watch talk show or something. And we would flip through it, expedite it, speed it up a little bit because it would be a video. And we would look at people as they come on stage and we'd say, what kind of pattern did they run? We're not listening to them talk. We're just watching them stand there. How do they approach someone? What do they do with their body language? What is going on with them? So we could start to understand a little bit more of where we go astray at communication. We put an awful lot into stories, and stories by design are never meant to be true. They're really just meant to be a tool for communication. We get tired of saying, well, I'm not sure this is the way it is, but maybe, right? So this year I'm going to throw out a lot of, I'm not sure the way it is, but maybe. And we'll kind of play back and forth with some of these ideas and come into play. It is worthwhile looking at some of these things. It's worthwhile looking at phenomena. It's worthwhile looking at all that kind of stuff and see how that flows and how it enriches our life or makes us look at things that are questionable and go a little deeper. Asking questions over and over again. You'll hear me say that. Ask questions. When I see something unusual, I ask a question. Where do I get more information? How do I find out what's going on? Right? Uh, am I guilty of making up stories? Oh, yeah, I do. Most certainly. We humans do that no matter what. But I would make up a story. I would tell somebody something, and I said, this is the way I think it is. We're going to have a workshop and we're going to play with it and see what happens. I don't mind being wrong. I really don't. It's like that's how you learn, right? So then it's rich. It becomes bigger. It becomes, I would like to ask more questions before I act. But life is redundant. Do you understand? The redundancy means that literally we move forward not knowing, and then when we find that we do know, we adapt. That's exactly how life is for us humans, right? And we have the neocortex in there that allows us to store that and process it. And we sleep at night. All mammals sleep, whales sleep and dream. Crazy. So that process goes on. We're constantly updating. So if I have anything to say, at bottom line, I'd say that, this whole game is geared towards life. Yes, it's a big universe, but we only know about 5% of it. So really in the big universe, we got a little tiny package. It doesn't look little to us because we're really little. But it does seem like this little package is an experiment in the idea of supporting the concept of life, not keeping it alive, but just supporting the idea of like, what can you do with something called life? What can you do with something called putting energy into form? How many different things you can do? Come on, it's like signing up for a painting class because you always wanted to paint. And so they give you a canvas and they give you paint and brush, and you spend the next year or two learning techniques so that you can make the picture look like something. It's hard to paint things like water, so on and so forth. So you play with different ideas and techniques to give you the the illusion of what is in your head, what is in your story, what is in your head in a picture. Then you're able to translate that to a craft into making something look like that. Well, that's what life's all about, right? We try to translate. We cut down a couple trees and build a house, and we try to translate it into someone's dreams. We try to package all that. We try to integrate all that. So is it evolving? Is it changing? Well, of course it's changing. We're no longer out on the savannah, Africa, running around. Yes, there was, don't forget, there was a lot of different versions of Homo erectus in the very beginning. That's like, so now pretty much the Homo sapiens are the only ones left, which means that we just killed all the rest of them off, warred with them or whatever, uh, because we had the ability to create bigger groups. That's the theory. I'm saying that the best theory is to like, can we make it a planetary people without killing off all the people that don't think like us? Can we do that? That's my goal. I'm not really sure that I'm going to get there in my lifetime, but I think that's an important goal. I'm not the only one working on it. So there's a, and now today, for Christmas, I just went and bought a couple $100 worth of books. I go down and buy books for my wife, and we went on a little trip to Bellingham, Washington, just because why not? And we went there and found a bookstore. They were called the Village Bookstores, and so we bought a bunch of books there. So now I have, a dozen books to read. So now I have to find a way to live long enough to finish reading the books. Um, and so, do you see? I'm telling you a setup and a game, right? Uh, Maybe you have a reason to live because you got a job. Maybe you have a reason to live because you have a bunch of kids. Maybe you have a reason to live because you want to express your art, right? But maybe you just want to learn more. I'm one of those people that got stuck in debt. I can't figure this all out. I want to learn more. And the more questions that I've asked, the more complex the thing has gotten. And so I finally got to the point somewhere around 40 or 45 years old that it's like, wow, this is really the game of asking questions. If When you find an answer, you make up a story and you're done. That's it. So if the answer is a tombstone, story's done. If you start to play with that and you say, oh, uh, here's something. What would happen here? What would happen there? I have changed jobs so many times because I was inspired by something I saw somebody doing. I go, wow, I'd like to try that. And I go back and quit my job and go down and apply for work what he's doing. Uh, yes, it doesn't seem very logical or reasonable, but I haven't been very logical or reasonable. I've basically pursued questions. And so that's where we're looking. Where does that take you? Where does that go? If mass is really all just an illusion, we're all doing a very good job of putting this all together so that everything within we'll play with some of those ideas this year, okay, and see where we can go with them. It's just for fun, right? Um, and see what goes down. Right. All right. So anyway, this has been fun. I most certainly would be delighted to answer questions. Email me at chris@wizardscatch.com and I will email you back and answer your question. At least I will give you my concept or idea. Or I will give you something that you can, I'll give you a book reference that you can look up. And or I might do a talk and kind of especially I like to do talks if I got five or six or eight or nine people ask the same questions. Then I'll do a talk because then I figure if I got eight people, then I got another 40 or 50 that had the same question and just were too lazy to to email me or or either that or just thought I didn't know anything anyhow, which might be very well true. Um, in any case, this is just a fun. It's engaging. I am engaging with you. It's not costing you anything. And you're engaging with me if you'd like to. All right? And so we're building a better planet and a way to get along. So I want to thank you very much. It's been fun and Happy New Year. Where if you're seeing this, you're probably into 2025. You probably made it. I haven't quite made it yet, but it's getting close. At least I have a plan. All right. So thank you and have a great year.